Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I was actually introduced already by Penny. I'm Jim Crown. But I really want to thank all of you for being here today. On behalf of the Aspen Institute, it's wonderful to have our speakers, our moderators, sponsors, colleagues, stakeholders, and especially guests back live and in person in this tent after a 3-year hiatus. And the sponsors listed here on the board, I actually just want to pause for a second. I cannot look at the Aspen Strategy Group logo and not think of Madeleine Albright, whose spirit has always filled this place and this tent and this event. And so I just want to acknowledge that before going on. So as board chair, I want, on behalf of the entire Institute, I want to say how pleased we are with what the Aspen Security Forum has been able to achieve this year. They went from a virtual security forum last summer to a first ever in-person security forum in Washington last fall, to being able to develop this continuous innovative programming on the most pressing foreign policy and national security issues of our times. And clearly, with the way the world has gone, paying attention to foreign policy and national security seems ever more urgent. I also want to acknowledge that we've had blending over the years between the Aspen Security Forum, the Aspen Strategy Group, and another body that has only a few years of existence, the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, of which Larry Summers is also a participant. And the blending of these topics, these people, and the ability to put on public programs that have these great minds and these great people available to everyone has just been a spectacular accomplishment, and it's great to have everybody back on the main stage. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. I'll go in the order they're sitting in, which is different than my notes. I'll start with Penny, who you all know. Penny Pritzker was our 38th Secretary of Commerce, and she did an incredible job in the years she was there. Before that, she was a core member of President Obama's economic team and served as the country's chief commercial advocate, traveling all over, as you've heard Secretary Raimondo is also doing. And Penny was also on the Obama Economic Council on Jobs and Competitiveness and the Economic Recovery Advisory Board. Since she returned to our hometown of Chicago, Penny founded PSP Partners, which is a global private investment firm. On her right is Zoe Baird, and Zoe is CEO and president of the Markle Foundation, and she went to the Markle Foundation after a diverse career as both a business executive and a prominent lawyer. Now, some of you might not be familiar with the Markle Foundation. Its priority is advancing solutions towards a labor market that will enable workers to move into well-paying jobs in the new economy. And under Zoe's leadership, she's established a nonpartisan state network in which 30 governors and the mayor of DC have engaged in modernizing their labor markets at a scale and pace that, frankly, many people never thought possible. On Zoe's right is Larry Summers. Larry is the Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard University. During the past 2 decades, he served in a series of senior positions, including the 71st Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton, Director of the National Economic Council under President Obama. And I have to give you a shout out, Larry. It was a year ago now that you talked about how bad inflation was going to get. And I think the room was about 50-50, all accomplished economists in the room. So it'll be interesting to see the next time we all meet how that group rounds out what their responses were. Bob was there too. On Larry's right is Bob Zoellick, senior consultant at Brunswick Geopolitical and senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. But most of Bob's life has been as a public servant, and the list is just daunting. He was White House Deputy Chief of Staff, 92-93, U.S. Trade Representative, 2001 to 2005, Deputy Secretary of State, 05 and 06, and then President of the World Bank from 07 to 12. And I've got a quote from Bob that is worth paying attention to. If America doesn't set the digital trade agenda, China certainly will. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the moderator and the discussion.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you. And thank you.
Can I just introduce our moderator by saying that Ed Luce writes as interesting and important a column about what's going on in Washington on a whole set of dimensions every week for the Financial Times, as I have the experience to read. And in addition to writing a number of books and all of that, he had the dubious privilege of writing speeches for me 25 years ago. But his columns are truly important, and I commend them to everybody in the room.
Thank you, Larry. I'm still going to ask you tough questions, but thank you. I appreciate
I'd expect nothing less.
Writing speeches for Larry Summers? That must have...
Taking dictation would be a better description. Thank you, everybody, for being here, particularly since the January 6th hearing grand finale is beginning in a few minutes. You are right in making the call that the proceedings here are going to be more consequential and more interesting. What we're going to discuss is not directly, obviously related to Aspen Security Forum, but economics is to geopolitics what economics is to politics. Critically important, and I think Secretary Raimondo, Penny helped bring out Secretary Raimondo's point on that. The chips really drive home that point. Let me just frame today's discussion with two observations. One is that all my adult life, inflation's been low, money's been easy for most of it, and it's been a salient, permanent feature of the landscape. And two, so has globalization. Globalization is natural as the moon and the stars. This is something that's just inevitable. And both are now, if not dead, then seriously in question. And as Mr. Cram pointed out, Larry has been making the point about inflation for 15, 16 months or more. So I wanted to make those points because they've been true all my life, and I suspect most of you a lot of you are quite eminent, so some of you actually might remember the era of high inflation, and therefore know just how important this turning point is. I want to start, Penny has to leave early, that's right. So I'm going to come to you second, Penny, but I want to start by asking Larry to frame this with two questions. The first is it too dramatic to say the era of easy money is over, of low inflation is over? And the second, more specifically and immediately, is your forecast, given your accuracy in the last year, 18 months, of the likelihood of a recession in 2023.
Thanks, Ed. It's up to us whether how long the era of inflation lasts. Inflation is eminently controllable. It's about the policy choices we make. If we make the necessary policy choices, there's not the slightest reason why we need to be a high inflation country 3 or 4 years from now. It depends on the choices that are made, most importantly by the Federal Reserve, but also by the President and the Congress. I don't think there can be any reasonable question but that serious errors were made with respect to fiscal and monetary policy in 2021, and that those have continuing significant consequences for the difficulties that we face today. I fear that the lesson of economic history is that what George Bernard Shaw said about second marriage is also true of soft landing. It represents the triumph of hope over experience. There are essentially no examples of high rates of inflation coupled with overheated economies giving way without significant increase in unemployment or recession in the modern era. across the industrialized world, when unemployment is below 4 and inflation is above 4, 90+% of the time, there is a recession within the next 2 years. So I think the preponderant probability is that if we are successful in bringing down inflation, we are likely in the process to go through a meaningful economic downturn. There's no reason to think it need be like the great financial crisis or like the 1982 recession, but I would be surprised if it didn't involve a meaningful interval with unemployment above 6%. There is a problem, I'll stop here. There is a problem, and I think we need to think about the way we do things, in asking government to make economic forecasts. Because forecasts for a government, or for that matter for a business, have an element of trying to say what you will happen, and an element of trying to say what you hope will happen, and what your target is. And so it's a little hard to interpret what exactly they mean. But I would judge the prospect that the Fed's latest forecast from June, that we will get out of this all the way down to 2% inflation without unemployment being above 4.1%. I would regard that forecast, not to mention the CBO's forecast, which calls for unemployment to always be below 4%, as representing the optimistic tail of possibility and nowhere near a reasonable best guess. And I would record that the fact that there are 19 separate members of the FOMC, each of whom are asked to make a forecast, no one of whom thinks that unemployment will peak above 4.5%, as suggesting a dangerous degree of groupthink and insularity if those forecasts are seriously intentioned as true statements. Now, you know, doctors who help people get de-addicted don't tend to exaggerate how bad withdrawal is going to be. And there is an element of that in this. So I want to be careful about blaming the people who are making those forecasts. But I don't, in all honesty, see how a serious analyst could think that a forecast that unemployment will peak at 4.1% was a forecast with a symmetrical range of error, subject to meaningful error on both sides.
So them getting inflation wrong has not been enough to puncture groupthink, in other words.
It certainly is not enough to cause them to adopt a forecasting methodology that causes them to think in ways that are like the people who forecast inflation more accurately than they did.
Okay. Right. Penny. One of the main features of this perhaps era of deglobalization or paused globalization or reverse globalization that we're moving into is a lot of talk, including from Secretary Raimondo and including from Secretary Yellen, and across the board really, of friend shoring, of ally shoring, of if not repatriating production, whether it be chips or masks or pandemic equipment, then at least regionalizing it and putting it in the countries of allies and friends. Is this something that you think, A, is going to happen? And B, what are the costs of this? Because globalization has produced a lot of things we might not fully appreciate, namely efficiency.
Well, you know, I think that I want to step back just a little bit and comment. You know, first of all, thank you, Larry, for giving us greater clarity about what's going on with the economy, because I think one of the biggest challenges, and I'll speak just as either as a business person, which is how I spend a lot of my time, but then also trying to think about the American, the average American. The economic analysis, obviously, Larry, I think you are expert, more than expert on that. But the average American, and we'll get to friendshoring in 1 second, but the average American is experiencing, real pain and getting squeezed, but they're actually have built up a savings, and so they've got some cushion. So they're able to live through, whether it's the issues around food or fuel or their mortgage rates going up. And that's affecting them to the tune of $5,000 to $7,000 a year at least. So we need to kind of put in perspective what a family that's maybe living off of $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 is a big impact on them. As it relates to business, we're in business, what you're seeing is, it's very confusing right now as a business person, because you've got, jobs are growing and yet the GDP is contracting. You're seeing price rising, and yet you're seeing wage growth falling. You're seeing consumer sentiment plummeting, and yet consumer spending is rising. A lot of them are traveling to hotels, thank you very much. Bank lending activity is way off. And a lot of banks are basically with pens down. So, and mortgage originations have plummeted 50%. So you're living in an economy and that's being, that is reacting to the current situation. And as business people, investment is, the bar to make new investment is extremely high. And so what's happening is you're not seeing new capital formation. Now, what does that mean then for the supply chain, which is really what you're asking about? If you step back and think about history, and I dare say that it's always terrifying to talk history in front of Bob and Larry because they know it, they've forgotten more than I know. But in the 1980s, when I was in business school, the central pillar of globalization was efficiency, right? And companies located their production where costs were lowest and governments had struck trade deals. And that lifted 1 billion people on this planet out of poverty. And that was a good thing. But this dynamic also, coupled with automation and a value shift in our economy from traditional manufacturing to more services, left many of our blue-collar workers really feeling left out. So today, now what's happened is this lean supply chain that we have is completely broken. And you've got bottlenecks, you've got increased cost, you've got lack of reliability of your inputs. And we have a whole series, a portfolio of businesses that we own and run, and we see it every day in our businesses trying to manage this. So, friendshoring, the result is that you have delays in inputs. So we're moving from just in time, you hear everyone talk about this, that no longer works. That was the pillar of what I learned in business school, to just in case, which means it's going to be more expensive and it is very painful to make these changes because you have to make new investments in order to do so. And I just said the economic environment is such that making new investments, the bar is high. But the necessity is there because we need a new kind of globalization that's about security and knowing that we can rely upon sources of inputs, whether it's chips, which the secretary talked about, but it's everything. It's all, it could be building materials, if you will, that are being made elsewhere. So yes, there is a shift going on, and I think that is also contributing to inflation, and that's something that's going to take time for us to work through, but it's going on. Companies now have to look not only at the geopolitical relationship between the United States and the country they're going to source from, or they look to move things here, only we don't have the people to make all of these goods. So this is a real serious challenge for our economy.
But just a quick follow-up, because I know it's pumpkin time for you and you have to leave, but a very quick follow-up. How do you define a friend? I mean, Vietnam is clearly not an ally, but if the goal here is to decouple from China, surely the neighbors that fear it ought to be treated as friends or allies in terms of having this new shoring policy. How would you define a friend? Who is going to orchestrate this?
Well, first of all, this is why there's this massive increase in consultants who are helping companies try to figure out who is a friend and what risk are you undertaking if you move your part of your manufacturing, let's say, as you said, from China to Vietnam, or what if I were to put more of my presence in Mexico, which I've always believed was, ultimately an opportunity. The problem is it's unclear that this government is reliable in that respect. So it's very complicated, and it's multidimensional, and hence there's, as I said, a growing consulting practice that's for companies all over the world. And boardrooms, people are sitting in boardrooms trying to figure this out and trying to work with their management teams that are recommending moving production from one place to another. And it's not just physical production, it's also, as the Secretary talked about, digital. The movement of digital trade is also very complicated. And the demand by many, many countries, including our allies, that we keep their data in their countries. So this is not simple, and there's no, here are the 3 criteria, and off you go.
Thank you, Penny. You've helped set the table for discussion. I know you have
I'm
to go.
sorry I have to run, but thank you all very much.
In a minute, I'll get to you, Zoe, but what Penny said, it does segue well onto what I want to ask Bob. So let me turn first to you, Bob. Perhaps the third sort of great feature of the last generation, in addition to globalization and low inflation, has been China being an engine of growth. China being also an engine of globalization, of course. We are now, supposedly, at least rhetorically, in an era of decoupling. Is decoupling actually happening? Do you see much evidence of it, A? And B, perhaps a little bit more philosophically, should it be happening? Are we aware of what the costs would be of creating basically an Asia-Pacific zone and the rest?
So first, let me thank the organizers of the Security Forum, because this is a huge event, and they've had tremendous number of speakers, and they've really done a great job. So thank you for doing that. So a couple points. First, to take China, China was the fastest growing source for U.S. exports for 15 years prior to the Trump administration. And the Trump administration took a different approach. They raised tariffs in the U.S. from about 3% to 20%, and China responded. And the Trump administration tried to put together a big new purchase package, which in analysis from groups like the Peterson Institute have basically said produced zip. Now, we still have about $600 billion of trade with China. It's our third largest sort of export market for goods. But as you notice, as you mentioned, you are seeing decoupling, definitely in the technology sector, increasingly in data, and a debate, which is also part of this, at least in one form, the CHIPS bill, is sort of finance and investment. That takes to the second point. You could hear a little bit of this even in Secretary Raimondo's comments. The U.S. has been schizophrenic. On the one hand, we say we want to reduce barriers in China, and if we do that, we'll actually trade more, but that will deepen our integration. At the same time, as in her words, we want to slow them down, we want to disconnect them, at the same time we open markets. That's a difficult trick to pull off. And in a sense, we haven't decided as a country, do we really want to open markets in China and do more business, or do we want to try to contain and isolate them, which will be very costly, and others in the region will not go along with it. The third point is, when you talk about trade, it's probably useful to go back to the basics. We don't do trade for charity, we do it out of our own interest. So about 50% of imports to the United States are components for American producers. So that trade helps them be more competitive and be stronger industries within the United States. There's also, including with a lot of the China goods, sort of direct consumption. And these are often for low-income families because it's clothing and toys and sort of some of the basic necessities of life. And just to give you an example, there's, again, a different study from the Peterson Institute that, again, these numbers you can always sort of, you have to, as Larry said, accept the range here. But they suggested if we just cut our overall tariff increases by about 2% on a trade basis, you'd save about $800 for an average household a year. Now, that's about half of what we did with the stimulus program. So cutting trade barriers, reducing costs for people does matter. And obviously, this has come back to the fore as people are attentive to inflation. Then there's the question of, okay, should we cut tariffs? And Catherine Tai, the US Trade Ambassador, said she wanted the leverage of the Chinese tariffs to cut tariffs. But it's been about a year and a half in the administration, and there's really no sign of such negotiations. Now, as Jim mentioned, I worked for Secretary Baker at the Treasury and State Department for a number of years, and Baker had an interesting comment. He said, you know, whether it's in politics or in hunting, a stationary target is the easiest to hit. So we're a sitting duck on trade. We're not moving, okay? And so when Secretary Raimondo was talking about some of the areas, it's interesting, but you have to ask, what will be translated from the press releases into action? So I'll close with this. Here's some specific things people could do. One, you got bipartisan support for the rewrite of NAFTA. That's the USMCA. Why not extend that to the United Kingdom after Brexit? It would be strategically important. The main appeal for Democrats of the USMCA was the labor provisions. A little hard for me to believe that Britain couldn't meet our labor standards, but so why not take that initiative? People have talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was built on US free trade agreements with 11 other countries. The Trump administration pulled back. The Biden administration is afraid to move on it. Maybe given the attitude towards China, it's be worth exploring. Is this a device to actually sort of counter China? Failing that, as Penny and Secretary Raimondo mentioned, so much of trade is now dependent on data and digital. And it's not just the tech industry. It's whether it's agriculture, it's Boeing sending back as the planes fly the information on their engines. And we have some sort of efforts that the United States has done in this area. But it'll be interesting to see whether the administration actually follows up on the rhetoric with actual agreements. And you could modulate these agreements for just sort of different levels. In the case of China, why not cut US tariffs, cut Chinese tariffs, and you could probably along the way get some changes in patterns like forced technology transfer by reducing joint venture requirements, higher penalties, intellectual property rights. The point being that we're dead in the water on trade. And the reality is, we talk a lot about our security interests in East Asia, and I'm sure people in East Asia are very glad to have the United States military defend them, but they're a little quizzical. Why aren't we interested in the economics of the region?
And this is where economics meets geopolitics. But Zoe, I want to ask you about a really important dimension to Larry's framing on the inflation point here, which is the conundrum we're seeing in the US labor market and other labor markets. Namely, we've got very low unemployment. We have a lot of jobs unfilled, a lot of jobs going around. We have high wage growth, although actually reduction in real wages because of inflation. And yet we don't really have a rise in the labor force participation ratio, or not a significant rise in that. In other words, people are not coming back into the labor force, even though there are jobs aplenty. Now, I don't know whether this is because there are lingering domestic caring situations from the pandemic, or whether there are deeper psychological impacts from the pandemic in terms of people's attitudes to work. But either way, it's a conundrum, right? And it's a conundrum that the Fed are looking at when it comes to non-inflationary wage growth in the future and academic concepts like that. Can you help untangle this puzzle?
Well, let me tackle it in a slightly different way. There are a whole variety of forces that are affecting the labor market. And to spend the time dwelling on trying to figure out that conundrum, I don't think is particularly fruitful. It may have been if you were working for Larry and he wanted to be able to talk about it, but there's just so much churn that I don't think looking back 3 weeks, 6 months, trying to forecast ahead, you know, whether women are going to go back into the labor force is really the most fruitful exercise. What we really ought to be putting ourselves as we're trying to think these problems through, I think, is to look at how much disruption there's been in the labor market, unprecedented disruption from COVID, from the acceleration of e-commerce, automation, adoption of artificial intelligence, adoption of robotics. That's really the key force that is most important, I think, to the future of the labor market. And why is that? Yes, it's cost us a lot of jobs, but the adoption of these technologies are also going to generate millions of jobs and have begun to generate millions of jobs. 59% of STEM jobs are held by people without a 4-year college degree. So we've already seen the beginning of a new labor market, and where I feel we ought to focus so we don't make the same mistake we made in 2009 when we came out of the Great Recession but did nothing in terms of policies or business model ambition to rebuild the middle class. Now we have an opportunity coming out of this transformation to really focus on what it would take to move back into an economy which is powered by a strong middle class, with workers with the skills needed, with innovation and entrepreneurship. You know, we forget that in 1970 we had 62% of Americans in middle income jobs, and before COVID it was 43%. So we really have an opportunity now to grapple with that fundamental point about whether the American economy is going to be strong. And our national security, as the Aspen Strategy Group knows, because I've talked about this there for years and written about it, our national security is fundamentally dependent on our economic security. And so that, to my mind, is the critical issue. And I think there are a couple of areas where we really need a national strategy. One is how we're going to deploy these technologies in a way that's inclusive. So this is not just a government strategy, it's a government and business and private sector strategy to figure out how to include small and medium-sized enterprises, to have the adoption of these technologies be inclusive. And then secondly, we really need a national strategy to train workers. The United States is in the bottom third of OECD countries in the amount of money we invest in worker training. Employers no longer train their workers. Anybody who's been in business for 20 years, 30 years knows how much that's changed. So we really need to rebuild the trained workforce, or that will be our next supply chain crisis.
Have you talked to Senator Manchin about this? I mean, getting bills passed is not easy nowadays, right?
Well, it's not all government money, and you've heard from Secretary Raimondo, there are large pools of government money, CHIPS Act, broadband, infrastructure. Infrastructure has changed too. You know, you no longer knock down a brick wall with a sledgehammer, you operate a robot. Women can do those jobs. So there's a tremendous opportunity if we're thoughtful.
Okay, Larry, I want to get you onto the sort of the globalization question. And I mean, if you like, respond to what Zoe's just said about the labor market, but particularly to what Penny and Bob were saying about America's lack of strategy in terms of trade, but also where you see globalization going. Is this a pause? Is this a reversal? Should it be a pause? Which is a separate question, whether something's happening and whether we want it to be happening.
Let me say 3 things. First, Zoe is doing the Lord's work. The Duke of Wellington said that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. the battle for America's future is going to be won or lost in the ways we train and prepare the 2/3 of Americans who are not going to get the kind of college degrees that the people in this room are getting. There is no more important long-run issue, and the fact that the principal human capital debate in Washington right now goes to whether we're going to relieve the $50,000 debts of Harvard MBAs is a tragedy and a travesty. And there is madness, and it is even more madness when it is being driven by the people who profess to be most progressive. And we need to get out of our fixation with college and what happens in the elite institutions and focus on that. In 1960, 4% of men between the ages of 25 and 55 were not working at any moment in time. Today, that number is 12%. That has a great deal to do with a broad swath of social problems across our country, and that is what Zoe is doing. She's doing it with state and local governments where there's a lot more receptivity. She's doing it with employers. This does not depend only on the federal action, and it is hugely, hugely important in my view. Second, I do not get much out of the discussions of friendshoring, which I think sets back clear thinking more than it advances it, I have to confess. Of course, every business has to think about the reliability of its supply chain, and every business does. And that happens, and it is a good thing. That is a different question than what is the appropriate policy of the federal government. I've never been in business, so I don't know that much about it, so I use hokey examples. But here's my hokey example. Imagine you're a car company that needs steering wheels, because your cars have to have steering wheels or you're not able to sell them. And you're worried about your regularity of your supply of steering wheels, and you wake up and you realize you have only one supplier of steering wheels, and it's a single point of failure. And so you think, oh my God, I have a problem. So there are three strategies you could pursue. One is you could decide to have 10 different suppliers of steering wheels. A second strategy you could pursue is to decide to have 3 months of inventory of steering wheels sitting around. And the third is that you should try to build your own steering wheel factory, which you'd never done before. I think most reasonable businesses would regard the third as a last resort and get as far as they could with the first two strategies. And that's how I think we ought to be thinking about this as a country. So yes, the CHIPS Act should pass. Gina Raimondo is completely right. People are going to, here's the talking point on that. I think it's a good one. People look at Germany and they go, how could they have been so reliant on Russian natural gas? They're going to look at us and they'll say, how could we have been so reliant on Taiwanese semiconductors? It is the right thing to do, but it is not that we need to do this in every single area. And every time I hear an administration official say, we need to do just in case, not just in time, we need to friendshore, and it's a great idea because it will create jobs. Confusion is being committed. We need to understand that right now the problem of the American economy is too many jobs and not enough people to fill them. That is why we have inflation. And so any policy that is being justified on the basis of job creation should be suspect. I'm not taking as much time on globalization because I agreed with essentially everything that Bob said. And I would say that Bob was, I think, right that we can't quite decide as a country whether we want to weave the interdependence tighter so we have more leverage, or whether we want to separate because somehow good fences will make good neighbors. I think he's right that we can't quite decide as a country, but I think I do know the answer, which is that when you try to weave the net tighter, you have more leverage, more influence, more contact, and more ultimate success. And the thing that I have always taken a lesson from, and it's a totally different area of policy, and I can think of 5 reasons why the analogy is no good. Bob could think of 20 reasons why the analogy is no good, but I think it makes a point. We developed a Cuba embargo policy in 1958. If you had told the authors of that policy that the Berlin Wall was going to go up and come down, that the Soviet Union was going to cease to be a union, that there were going to be a large number of McDonald's in Red Square, that a Chinese official was going to say to be rich is glorious, and that the Cuban government that was there in 1958 was still going to be there, I think they would have wondered about the wisdom of their isolation strategy. And I think there is a powerful lesson in that about the capacity of isolation strategies to breed continuing truculence. So I agree with Bob about the dichotomy, but I think there's a direction in which we should push things.
Bob.
So a couple of times you've referenced sort of the passing or end of globalization. And yet, as I was in the security forum today, we talked about world energy prices, world food prices. We talked about debt and global interest rates. There was COVID. There's carbon and climate change. And I'm kind of wondering, is globalization really dead? It doesn't look dead to me. So the phenomena of globalization are real, and they're not going away. What's changed is the fragmentation and the frictions that we've added into the globalization system. And the world is still going to be interdependent, whether politically we sort of prefer it to be not or whichever. But we're just adding costs. And the one thing, just to be a little provocative here about the $52 billion TRIPS bill, that bill started out with Todd Young and I think Senator Schumer. It's called the Endless Frontier Act, and it was based on a man named Vannevar Bush who sort of helped develop American science policy after World War II. And the whole logic was to invest in R&D and early stage development, okay? I've read in recent days some of that may come back, but not surprisingly, the bill got hijacked by a number of semiconductor firms that build a commodity product that takes a lot of capital, and they wouldn't otherwise build it. And so they said, we need the government to give us money. I'm sure Larry remembers this. It'll be interesting if Secretary Raimondo has ever briefed on something called Semitech, which was another big semiconductor effort and development. Now, Larry makes a good point. And by the way, when you see the advocacy for this bill, it says, oh, our production share has gone down. Now, our share of the tools for semiconductor, our share of the design, our share of the software is about 50%. So if it's a concern about the security, you have to look at the whole value chain, and you have to ask, how critical is it for the United States to be doing a commodity production of the semiconductors? By the way, there's lots of different types of semiconductors. I personally suspect this bill will get passed and start to be implemented about the time that we're going to see reversal. You can already start to see it in some of the semiconductor market. Part of what they rode was the fact that people's demand, their purchasing plans for autos and others after COVID were sort of misjudged. My point on this is, number one, is I agree with Larry about, the Taiwanese problem. I think Taiwan's kind of dependent on the United States. Maybe there's a way we could have gotten more Taiwanese production in the United States without $50 billion. And maybe if they build it in Germany, is that so unsafe for the United States? We think the Germans are going to turn on us. So my point about this is let's scrutinize. We had the $52 billion bill of this, the other $50 billion bill of that. It's part of a pattern that you now see, which is sort of fortress economics. It's a combination of COVID and supply chains and sort of the sanctions. And you can see it in Europe, where they're talking about strategic autonomy. You can see it in China, where they're talking about sort of the dual circulation policy and kind of a traditional self-strengthening. And you can see it in the US, where President Biden talks about Buy America. We couldn't even have Buy North America, as Penny would have suggested. So my point is simply this. There's a wave that goes forward about, well, the government has to provide support for this, and the government has to subsidize this. I'm sure people in this audience are totally familiar with every industry that likes to get additional financial support, particularly for a large-scale investment with a large capital cost. Is that the right thing for the U.S. to do, or maybe the $50 billion should have been spent somewhere else? These are the questions we're going to be facing.
Let me say, can I come in on this? I don't know quite how to react. I basically.
That's why I said it.
I basically didn't.
It's rare for people.
I basically didn't like the budget spending that gave all the inflation. I basically didn't like the friend sharing. I didn't like much of anything, and so I thought there was something they were doing that I would speak up in favor of.
But I pulled them out.
And you don't like the fact that I spoke out in favor of that. I think I'm partway with you actually, and partway not. I think that maybe a proposition on which we can all in this room agree is that the best generals are the ones who hate war the most. And the best industrial policy people are the ones who hate it the most, not the ones who are most enthusiastic about it. And industrial policy should be something you do with huge reluctance. And I agree with you, and if I'd had more time, I would have done the be reluctant about, what was that?
I said we can stop there.
Right, we can be reluctant.
Baker used to tell me, he said, Bob, you know, when someone agrees with your point, you can stop arguing.
Right, so we're there. I do think, relative to what I thought 20 years ago, when I thought all the things that you're saying, and I still think all the things you're saying, but I have become more convinced that learning curves are a powerful thing in the world. And I have become more convinced that when you force things to be done at scale, they end up getting cheaper and cheaper. The big example is solar and wind power, where I thought 10 years ago that stopping global warming was all about getting the price of energy up super high with a $100 a ton carbon tax, and that was a big political problem. And I now think if we do the right kinds of things, we can do it at much lower cost. But I think that economists like to think about externalities and all that. You've all heard that. I think there's a different kind of classic problem, which is a chicken and egg problem. You need the chicken to have the egg, and you need the egg to have the chicken, and so somebody needs to do something from outside. And I think there is truth in that in some contexts. And so if you can do it in careful, disciplined ways, I think some version of the CHIPS Act is going to be right. And I think that, yes, we should have used leverage with Taiwan to get TSMC here, and yes, that would be better. And yes, this thing will get captured more by politics than it should. But I think on balance, it's better to do it than not to have done it. I agree with you completely that there is no peaceful, halfway decent world without a huge degree of global integration. And so the debate is, what is the right strategy for managing it and handling it? Not, is there some new viable world without globalization? I agree 100% with what you said there.
Zoe, I want to get to you before we go to questions and get you, all roads are leading to and from Larry at the moment, but I want you to respond to Larry's earlier comments about the wisdom of debt forgiveness as opposed to investing in the future of work. What is it that the Biden administration could practically be doing, given the political climate, to further your very important agenda?
Well, thank you for the question. Thanks to Larry. First of all, I think I want to agree with Larry's last set of comments, although I can't necessarily say I agree with them all because there's so many points there. But the essence of what I agree with is the importance of having a domestic industry, because there are people sitting in the front row here who know more about technology industries than I do, but I've lived deeply in it. And if you don't have participation in the innovation, in the design, in the experimentation of manufacturing and producing product, you cannot be a leader. And if we don't have, and I probably should say my husband came out of the semiconductor industry years ago, but if we don't have participants in the supply chain, if we don't have participants in the innovation in the next generation of chips and in the uses and applications of those chips, we will not be on the leading edge. And a lot of the processes that are used to create chips will be critical to the next generation of technology too. So that's where I agree with Larry, and I pass on the other points I might have missed. And that leads me to what people can do around workforce, because people here in business or in government, they invest in things, they invest in philanthropy. We actually need something that some people might call industrial policy, but it really is ambition by government, state and local and federal, and the private sector to make decisions that open up that innovation, that enable participation by a broader set of people so that we get the broader set of innovation and skills and talents. And so if you look at something like 3D printing, which is an additive manufacturing process that is expected to disrupt $3 to $6 trillion of the global economy by 2030. 3D printing can either be a concentrated industry where companies like IBM, who are really leaders in that industry now, are generating the software, controlling the hardware, the investments in regional centers, the training, and doing a great job at it. Or you can pick up on IBM's invitation to create an industry where there are multiple winners, where you do have just-in-time production of parts, manufactured parts where they're needed, where you reduce transportation costs, and we're gonna lose truck drivers anyway to autonomous vehicles, so we might as well lose the transportation costs, and locate these facilities where they're needed. So this is not an old-fashioned industrial age industrial policy. It's all the participants in the market, driven by the private sector, trying to have these sectors develop in a way that maximizes the participation, and then we need the investment in the training so that is tightly tethered to the jobs that are being created so that we can have the workforce we need.
Larry, I'll give you the final word.
Here's a policy that my family pursues that I would recommend to everyone in this room. Give 10%, whatever amount of money you give to the relatively elite four-year institutions that you are associated with. Find a local community college and give 10% as much money and 10% as much time to helping them. And if everyone in this room did that, and that idea spread, given the relative amounts of money that go to community colleges and go to leading universities and colleges, it would be transformative. And I'll give you one, I've not taken advantage of this part of it, but I'll tell you one lesson I've learned. A naming opportunity at a community college goes for about 1/15 the price that it does at an Ivy League school. So if you want a building named after you or a professorship named after you, there are bargains on offer, and you'll actually do much more for the world.
Tithing for community college is not a note I expected to end on, but it's in keeping with the very broad range of issues we've discussed. Thank you so much to all three of you and to Penny for a wonderful discussion, and Anya, to you for hosting it, and I guess I'm turning it over to you, am I? You got an answer? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to all 5 of you. I also want to thank the Hearst family for making this public programming possible. And we are, for all you Aspen Security Forum attendees, we are reconvening tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with a jam-packed program. We are going to hear from the commander of the Special Operations Command, from Senators Ernst and Warner, from Eric Schmidt, from former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, from 3 former national security advisors, including Condoleezza Rice, and then last but not least, from Jake Sullivan, our current national security advisor. And as the legendary Judy Woodruff would say, all that and much more at tomorrow's Aspen Security Forum. So enjoy your evening. Thank you.